Donald Trump promised this would be a short war, a clean war, a war that would pay for itself through lower oil prices and a stable Middle East. 20 days later, the Pentagon just asked Congress for $200 billion in additional funding. $200 billion in 20 days. The entire Iraq war, which lasted nearly 9 years and cost over $2 trillion total, averaged roughly $220 billion per year. America is now spending at that same rate in its first 3 weeks, and the war has no end in sight. If you watch this video to the end, you will understand exactly what that $200 billion number means, where it comes from, who pays for it, and what it tells us about how long this war is actually going to last. Because that number is not just a budget request. It is a confession that the war America was told would be quick, clean, and decisive is none of those things. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This is the analysis that goes deeper than the headlines. Now let's go. To understand what $200 billion in 20 days actually means, you first need to understand what the people who sold this war promised it would cost. In the days before Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th, the Trump administration's public messaging was consistent. This would be a targeted, decisive military operation. Iran's nuclear program would be eliminated. The regime's leadership would be decapitated. The IRGC's military capacity would be destroyed. And then, the logic went, the Iranian people would rise up, the regime would collapse, and America would have delivered a historic victory that stabilized the Middle East and removed a nuclear threat, all without the kind of prolonged, expensive ground campaign that defined the disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trump himself pointed to the economic upside. With Iran's threat removed, he argued, oil prices would fall, the Strait of Hormuz would reopen, Gulf energy would flow freely again, American consumers would see lower gas prices, not higher ones. The war would pay for itself. That was the promise. Here is the reality 20 days later. Oil is at $115 a barrel, the highest level since the COVID-19 pandemic. Gas prices in the United States have risen 90 cents per gallon in 20 days, the fastest sustained increase since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Qatar's Ras Laffan terminal, which handles roughly 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, is damaged and operating at reduced capacity. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE have all had energy infrastructure struck by Iranian missiles and drones. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed to commercial shipping. European gas prices surged 24% in a single morning this week. The Federal Reserve held interest rates unchanged, signaling deep uncertainty about the inflationary pressure building in the global economy. Asian stock markets are falling. The Nikkei dropped 2.7%, the Kospi dropped 2.6%, and the Pentagon just asked for $200 billion more. Let's break down what that number actually represents, because the way it has been reported as a single dramatic figure obscures the specific and devastating story inside it. The $200 billion supplemental funding request covers several categories of spending. The most significant single component is munitions replacement. In 20 days of the most intense air campaign in modern history, the United States and Israel have expended an extraordinary volume of precision-guided weapons, Tomahawk cruise missiles, joint direct attack munitions, massive ordnance penetrators, the 30,000-pound bunker busters used against Iran's deepest underground facilities, small-diameter bombs, air-to-surface missiles of multiple varieties. Each of these weapons costs tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit. The Tomahawk missile, for instance, costs approximately $2 million per shot. American and Israeli forces have fired hundreds of them. The United States military has a finite stockpile of precision munitions. Those stockpiles were already being carefully managed before this war began, in part because of the pace of weapons deliveries to Ukraine and Israel over the previous 4 years. This war has accelerated the drawdown of those stockpiles at a rate that alarmed Pentagon planners even before the fighting began. The $200 billion request is in large part an attempt to restart the production lines and rebuild the inventory before the gap between what America has and what it needs becomes strategically significant. The second major component is operational costs. Flying B-2 bombers from their bases in Missouri across the Atlantic and into the Middle East and back repeatedly costs an extraordinary amount per sortie. Maintaining multiple carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf region, each of which requires continuous resupply, maintenance, and crew support, costs millions of dollars per day per group. The 2,500 Marines currently racing toward the Strait of Hormuz aboard the USS Tripoli and its accompanying vessels are burning fuel at a rate that would be remarkable in peacetime exercises. In a war zone at maximum speed, the cost is significantly higher. The third component is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Maintaining the satellite coverage, the drone overflights, the signals intelligence collection, and the human intelligence networks necessary to prosecute a war at this scale and intensity is enormously expensive. Every time a high-value Iranian official is located and killed, the intelligence operation that identified their location and tracked their movements cost millions of dollars that do not appear in any single line item but accumulate relentlessly in the overall cost. The fourth component is what the military calls theater security. Defending American bases across the Middle East from the relentless Iranian missile and drone campaign that has been targeting them since day one of this war requires active air defense systems that consume interceptor missiles at a significant rate. The Patriot interceptor missile, for instance, costs approximately $4 million per shot. Every Iranian drone that is shot down over a U.S. base in Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, or Bahrain costs America $4 million to stop. Iran has launched close to 2,000 drones since February 28th. If you are finding this level of analysis useful, subscribe to the channel now. This is the kind of breakdown that puts the numbers into context that the news rarely provides. Let's keep going. Now, here is the part that makes the $200 billion figure genuinely alarming beyond the number itself. This is a supplemental request. It is money being asked for on top of the existing defense budget. The United States already has the largest military budget in the world, at approximately $886 billion for fiscal year 2026. The Pentagon is asking for $200 billion on top of that, in the first 20 days of a war that has no defined end date, no agreed exit conditions beyond Iran's unconditional surrender, and no indication from the Iranian side that surrender is even under consideration. The new Iranian Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, in his first foreign policy session after being selected, rejected all ceasefire proposals and demanded that the United States and Israel be brought to their knees before any negotiation could begin. He has not appeared publicly since his selection. He is reportedly receiving medical treatment in Moscow for injuries sustained in the opening strikes. And his first substantive position on the war was total rejection of any path to peace that does not involve American and Israeli humiliation. The math of this situation is brutal and straightforward. America is spending money at a rate comparable to the Iraq War's annual average, except this war is in its first month, not its fifth year. The Iraq War's costs were spread across nearly a decade of grinding insurgency. The Iran War's costs are being compressed into weeks. If the conflict continues at anywhere near this intensity for another 2 months, the supplemental request will need to be supplemented again. And the economic consequences for ordinary Americans are compounding in real time. Gas prices at 90 cents per gallon higher than 3 weeks ago sounds like an abstraction until you consider what it means at scale. The average American drives approximately 15,000 miles per year in a vehicle that gets around 28 miles per gallon. That works out to roughly 535 gallons of gasoline per year. At 90 cents per gallon more, that is approximately $480 per year per car. For a 2-car household, nearly $1,000 per year in additional fuel costs, directly caused by this war, on top of the higher electricity costs, higher food costs, and higher prices for everything that moves by truck. Those costs are not being offset by the lower oil prices Trump promised. They are being added to by the $200 billion supplemental request, because that money does not materialize from thin air. It is financed through Treasury borrowing, which adds to the national debt, which increases the interest payments that crowd out other federal spending, which ultimately reaches ordinary Americans through reduced public services, higher taxes, or inflation as the Treasury issues more debt into a market that is already absorbing extraordinary volumes of new supply. This is the economic reality of the war that was supposed to pay for itself. But the $200 billion request tells an even more troubling story when you look at what is not included in it. The supplemental request covers operational costs and munitions replacement. It does not cover the long-term costs of caring for American veterans who are being wounded in this conflict. 7 American service members have already been killed. The Pentagon says approximately 140 have been wounded, with 9 suffering serious injuries. The medical care, rehabilitation, disability benefits, and lifetime support costs for those injured veterans will add billions more to the total cost of this war over the coming decades, just as the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have added hundreds of billions to the long-term cost of those conflicts. It does not cover the cost of the damage being done to American alliances. Germany, France, Australia, Japan, and most of NATO have refused Trump's requests to send warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Those refusals are not just inconvenient in the short term. They represent a fracturing of the alliance relationships that have underpinned American global strategy for 8 decades. Rebuilding them, if they can be rebuilt, will cost enormous political capital and diplomatic resources that do not appear in any budget line. And it does not cover the economic damage being done to the global trading system that American prosperity depends on. When the Strait of Hormuz is closed, when Gulf energy infrastructure is being struck by Iranian missiles, when shipping companies are rerouting vessels thousands of miles out of their way to avoid the Persian Gulf, the cost is not borne by the U.S. military budget. It is borne by every business and every consumer in every country that buys or sells anything in the global economy. That cost is incalculable, but it is real, and it is accumulating every day this war continues. There is one more element of this story that has received almost no attention, but that may be the most important number inside the $200 billion request. Tucked into the Pentagon's supplemental budget documents is a significant allocation for what the military calls long-range strike replenishment. This is the category that covers the production of new Tomahawk missiles, new bunker-busting munitions, and the hypersonic weapons that the United States has been developing and beginning to deploy. The scale of the replenishment request in this category is not just about replacing what has been fired in Iran. It is about rebuilding stockpiles against the possibility of a future conflict with a much larger adversary. Military analysts who have reviewed the supplemental request describe the munitions replenishment figures as clearly sized for deterrence against China, not just continuation of the Iran war. The message embedded in those numbers is that the United States military, after 20 days of intense combat in Iran, is aware that it has drawn down its precision munitions inventory in ways that could create vulnerability in the Indo-Pacific, and it wants Congress to fund the rebuilding of that capability urgently. That is the strategic picture behind the budget request. America is fighting one war while its military planners are simultaneously worried about whether the cost of that war is creating openings for a completely different adversary on the other side of the world. China has been watching every development in this war with extraordinary attention. How quickly American precision munitions stockpiles deplete under sustained combat. How long it takes to reconstitute them. How much economic pressure a war of this scale creates. How the United States manages the tension between fighting one war and maintaining deterrence against another. Every piece of that picture informs Chinese strategic planning for Taiwan. The $200 billion is not just the cost of 20 days of war with Iran. It is the cost of 20 days of war with Iran, plus the cost of maintaining deterrence against China, plus the cost of the economic damage being done to American alliances, plus the cost of the energy shock rippling through the global economy. And it is being presented to Congress as a single supplemental request, as if it is a discrete one-time expense rather than the opening installment of a cost that will continue to accumulate for years. Now let's talk about what actually ends this war. Because without a path to ending it, the $200 billion request is just the first of many. The United States has stated its conditions for ending the war: unconditional surrender, regime change, and the permanent elimination of Iran's nuclear capability. Iran's new supreme leader has stated his conditions for any negotiation. America and Israel must be brought to their knees first. Those two positions are not the starting points of a negotiation. They are the declarations of two parties who are not yet ready to negotiate. The question of what changes that dynamic is the most important question in the world right now. And the $200 billion supplemental request is one clue. At some point, the economic and political cost of continuing this war will force one side or both to reconsider its maximalist position. The question is, which side reaches that point first, and at what cost to the global economy in the meantime? Iran has less to lose economically. Its economy was already devastated by decades of sanctions, and the war has destroyed whatever remained of its industrial and energy infrastructure. It is fighting from a position of total loss, which means the economic cost of continuing to fight is lower in relative terms than it appears in absolute terms. America has far more to lose economically. The $200 billion request, the rising gas prices, the falling stock markets, the fractured alliances, the inflation risk, the political cost among voters who are already showing significant opposition to the war in polling, all of these create pressure that has no equivalent on the Iranian side. That asymmetry, the fact that a country with nothing left to lose feels less economic pain per dollar of war cost than a country with everything to protect, is the fundamental strategic problem that $200 billion cannot solve. It can replace missiles. It cannot change the underlying logic of a war between a superpower that has everything to protect and an adversary that has already lost almost everything it had. So let's bring this together. The Pentagon just asked for $200 billion in supplemental funding 20 days into a war that was supposed to be short, clean, and self-financing. That request represents the cost of munitions burned, operations sustained, bases defended, and stockpiles rebuilt for the next potential conflict. It represents the opening installment of a bill that will continue to grow for every day this war continues with no negotiated exit in sight. And it reveals, more clearly than any single news story or official statement, the gap between the war that was promised to the American people and the war that is actually being fought. The Iraq War cost $2 trillion across 9 years. America is spending at that rate in its first 3 weeks. Gas prices are the highest since 2022. Oil is at $115. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. 3 Gulf allies were struck in a single night. The new Iranian supreme leader rejected every ceasefire proposal, and the Pentagon needs $200 billion more right now. That is not the cost of a war that is winning. That is the cost of a war that has become something much bigger and much more expensive than anyone who started it was willing to say out loud. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. On this channel, we break down the world behind the headlines, geopolitics, economics, and global power in a way that actually makes sense. If this gave you a clearer picture of what is happening and what it means for your daily life, please subscribe and leave a like. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the economic pressure will force a negotiation before this war reaches the cost of Iraq? I read every single comment, and I will see you in the next video.